Welcome to our world. In the fall of 1941, as German forces surged deep into Soviet territory, their leaders brimmed with confidence that the Soviet Union, like Poland and France before it, would crumble in months. The initial victories of Operation Barbarossa had fueled an air of triumph, and preparations for a grand German victory parade through Moscow's iconic Red Square were set in motion. Soldiers joked about which battalion would be the first to march through Moscow's heart, a parade Hitler himself intended to oversee. But history had other plans. By the bitter winter of 1941, the relentless Soviet resistance turned the tide. The Battle of Moscow, with its brutal counter-offensive, not only halted the German advance but pushed their forces back from the capital's gates. Hitler's dream of marching his troops through Red Square evaporated in the frozen wastes of the Eastern Front. Yet, Joseph Stalin, ever aware of the German obsession with parading through Moscow, did something remarkable 2.5 years later. As the Soviet Union began to push German forces back on all fronts, Stalin orchestrated a parade in Moscow, a parade of Germans. However, this was not the victorious spectacle Hitler envisioned. It was the parade of the defeated, a macabre procession of 57,000 ragged, beaten German prisoners of war, limping through the streets of Moscow, a living testament to the Soviet triumph and a grim reminder of Nazi failure. This event, largely overshadowed in Western histories of World War II, is one of the most potent and symbolic moments of the entire conflict. The scene was unprecedented. Thousands of defeated German soldiers, dirty, wounded, and exhausted, marched under Soviet guard while more than 120,000 Muscovites looked on, silently witnessing the broken remnants of the once feared Wehrmacht. Hitler's dream had come true, in the most humiliating way possible for the Germans. In the summer of 1944, during one of the Red Army's most devastating offensives, Operation Bagration, the Soviet forces crushed Army Group Center in Belarus, dealing the most catastrophic blow the German military had ever suffered. Up to 500,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured within weeks, and the mighty Army Group Center, which had once driven toward Moscow, was annihilated. As one historian famously remarked, Operation Bagration ripped the heart out of the German army in the east, marking a decisive turning point in the war. From that moment on, the Red Army's march to Berlin seemed inevitable. The scale of the victory in Belarus was so immense that Stalin and the Soviet leadership felt it deserved a spectacle. But rather than celebrating with a parade of their own triumphant soldiers, they chose to display their victory by parading the vanquished. Known as Operation Grand Waltz, this grotesque pageant was organized with characteristic Soviet secrecy, and its name, ironically borrowed from a 1938 American musical, added a dark, almost cinematic flair to the grim proceedings. Unlike typical military parades, where victorious troops march proudly in uniform, Operation Grand Waltz aimed to show the defeated Germans in their most wretched state. Most of the prisoners had been captured near Minsk after the Red Army's retaking of Belarus. Of the nearly 500,000 captured, only 57,600 were deemed fit to march. The rest were either too wounded or too sick. In the days leading up to the parade, the prisoners were intentionally kept dirty, unwashed, and in the same clothes they had been captured in. Many were barefoot, emaciated, and weak, the physical embodiment of Nazi defeat. Starting on July 14, 1944, trains packed with these prisoners began arriving in Moscow. Upon their arrival, they were held in various locations, including the Moscow Hippodrome, the Dynamo Moscow Stadium, and military fields, where they were given meager rations and barely enough water to survive. One prisoner later remarked, "It was enough to quench my thirst, but not enough to wash my face." On July 17, at 11 a.m., the defeated Germans were divided into two groups for the march. Leading the procession were 19 generals and 6 colonels, men who had once commanded vast divisions of Hitler's army. They were followed by over 1,000 officers and then, at the rear, by the common infantrymen, walking in ragged columns of 600 each. The generals, with their medals and uniforms, contrasted sharply with the barefoot and bedraggled soldiers trudging behind them. As they marched through the streets of Moscow, flanked by tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers and NKVD officers, an eerie silence enveloped the city. Muscovites lined the streets and balconies, watching in quiet anticipation. Some shouted insults, a few threw objects, but the NKVD quickly intervened. Most just stared at the spectacle in disbelief. For many, this was a deeply emotional moment, a parade of retribution for the years of suffering inflicted upon them by the Nazis. The Germans, for their part, reacted in various ways. Some stared at the Soviet crowds with hatred, others with curiosity, but most, drained of energy, simply marched in silence. One German soldier later recounted, "We were used to following orders, so as we walked through the streets of Moscow, we simply obeyed the orders of our escorts." Among the Soviet citizens watching, there was a sense of vindication. Young Romanchenko, who witnessed the parade, recalled the moment, "We watched the Germans up close, in a deathly silence. No one said a word, neither them nor us." The Soviet newspaper Pravda described the event with biting disdain, "A repulsive green mold oozed from Moscow's Hippodrome onto the clean and ever-festive Leningradskoy highway. This bizarre bipedal scum, whom the maniac had convinced were the best of mankind, passed before us, lanky and frail, with ragged pants, heads hanging like stray dogs awaiting a bullet." After hours of marching, the prisoners reached their final destination, where they were herded onto trains and sent to labor camps. Their task now was to help rebuild the very cities they had once tried to destroy, starting with Moscow. Behind them, trucks sprayed water on the streets, symbolically cleansing the city of fascism. To the Muscovites, the streets had been washed clean of the Nazi threat. In the West, the event drew some criticism. The Guardian wrote about Soviet cruelty, and American radio commentators expressed concern over the treatment of the Germans. But within the Soviet Union, such criticisms fell on deaf ears. For the people of Moscow, this was more than a parade, it was poetic justice. The parade of the defeated remains one of the most striking moments of World War II, a chilling reminder that triumphs in war are often accompanied by scenes of human degradation. What had begun as Hitler's dream of victory over Moscow ended in humiliation for his army, as they were marched like cattle through the streets they had once sought to conquer. Stalin, ever the master of symbolism, had given the Germans their parade after all, but in a way they could never have imagined. Thank you for joining us on Our World. If you found this content valuable, please like, comment, and subscribe.